So, welcome everybody. This is the 9th lecture in my course on Tranquility and Insight. And as usual, we start again with those who have put some questions on the forum. Thanks to all of you who are participating in that. There's 3 questions by Jayanta Gunawardana. These are still related to an earlier lecture to Madhyama-āgama 76 and its parallel in the Anguttara Nikaya. It was Anguttara Nikaya 863, that was that new parallel that we discovered in the course of this course. And one is about the expression in the Pāli version before the practice of Satipatthana. We have this expression with the mind firm and well settled internally. And he is asking whether this has any specific significance since the Chinese version speaks of imperturbable. So the Chinese version reads like this. You should train in such a way that the mind becomes settled, staying imperturbable within. And I would personally think that the fact that the term imperturbable is used here, I would take it to point to rather deep concentration. And if we look at the Pāli, ajhattang chittang tittang hoti susantitang. From the Pāli, I also get the impression that this is talking about a considerably deep degree of samatha or concentration that is already established. Then he asks about the expression jhana with comfort or without comfort. Actually, it is not jhana, but there's this instruction. You develop this concentration with this and with that. And so in the Anguttara Nikaya we first have Sata Sahagata, which Bhikkhu Bodhi translates as accompanied by comfort. And then the final one is accompanied by equanimity, which implicitly then, as Jayanta says, means that this is without comfort. In the Chinese version we have 3 terms here. The first is conjoined with happiness, which I think is corresponds to Sata Sagata, even though normally you would expect Sukha there. But I would take the reference to Sata in the Anguttara Nikaya to be pretty much similar to the idea of Sukha. And at the end we also get conjoined with equanimity. So we have the basic progression there is similar, but between that we get this conjoined with concentration, and as translators we have added totally stable because we didn't really know what to do with that. And I simply don't really understand why there is this additional mentioning of concentration in between the two, and I have not come across this anywhere else. Literally it would just be mean conjoined with concentration, and concentration has been long developed before, and it also doesn't make much sense to say develop this concentration conjoined with concentration. So I personally take this to be an error in the text. But the basic progression then is the same. So we get first the presence of the factors of the first jhana, vitakka vichara, which I like to translate as initial and sustained mental application. Then these are dropped and you get with piti, with joy and without, with sukha, happiness or sata in the Pāli, pointing to the third absorption in the sutta scheme, and then with equanimity pointing to the fourth. So I think the basic progression described in the 2 discourses is the same. And the third question that he had was about the sequence. You might remember we had these 3 main topics in the discourse. One was the Brahma Viharas, the 4 divine abodes, if you like. Then there were the 4 jhanas and the 4 satipatthanas. And in the parallel version, the sequence in which these were given is different. And so his question was whether they point to any particular way of development. And my personal suggestion would be to not see these as being fixed in any particular way. This is the advantage we can maybe draw from having such variations in the parallel versions. Basically, it seems that there is no fixed sequence, and that relates us back also to the Yogananda-sutta that we discussed in the very first lecture by Bhikkhu Bodhi also. That basically there does not seem to be a fixed sequence in which one has to do the practice. So the approach can be flexible and according to one's personal requirements. So now we move on to Madhyama-āgama 78. That is the discourse where we have this story about Brahma and the Buddha visiting Brahma, and then the two engaging in I call it a hide and seek competition. This comment is from Jeff Hardin. He says, Bhikkhu Bodhi comments that Madhyama Nikāya 49 can be read as an allegory to Madhyama Nikāya 1, the Mulapariyaya Sutta, a dramatic representation in abstract philosophical terms. And he says that I also call Madhyama-āgama 78 and Madhyama Nikāya 49 an allegory. In general, the Pāli canon seems to contain much less allegorical, symbolical and mythical writing than the scriptures of the other world religions. Have you written about or discussed how to wisely view allegorical writing in this body of work that is by and large logical, direct and utilitarian? Yeah, on my own, I would perhaps not have qualified the canon entirely as largely logical, direct and utilitarian. I think there's a lot of pragmatism there, but maybe the reason why I am a little wary of this type of characterization is that there's a historically there's a tendency of reading the early discourses in a way that conformed to certain Western ideas. This has its history has its root in the history of Buddhist scholarships and outstanding scholars like T.V. Rice Davis, etc. And so there is sometimes a tendency to see predominantly what is logical, direct and utilitarian. And in my own study and also influenced by other scholars, I have come to more and more appreciate the fact that there's a considerable richness already in early Buddhist discourse, and there is a lot that is not as easily compatible with our Western ideas and expectations, but it is still part of the original teachings. And I've been trying to comment on this in these past years with all of you in these courses, also always pointing out that there are these, like we had this surprising shift from this Upakilesa Sutta with this powerful description of inner light and concentration experience, and then we get this next discourse in the Madhyama-āgama with all these gods, and you all help me with the homework to make sense out of this. And both discourses stand in the same collection side by side, have Pāli parallels, show no particular reason for considering one of them to be substantially different in terms of historical strata from the other. So I think one point is to simply make room for the fact that these these discourses originated in a very different world 2,500 years ago, where inner and outer, logic and mystic etc., were not maybe as clearly distinct categories as we experience them in the modern Western setting. And also to be clearly aware, and I think all of you are aware of that, simply because of reading all these discourses side by side, that what we have in front of us are of course not verbatim records. I mean, I know Jeff knows that. I'm just saying that in general. I'm not so much responding to Jeff. I'm just saying this kind of what comes to my mind on this topic. I have some of my friends, some of my monastic friends in Asia. They take everything literal, and that becomes really difficult. Then, especially, as good monks, we are supposed to study the Vinaya, and in the Vinaya there are some, how shall we call them, some wild stories. Yeah, there's a monk who actually is a snake, a naga, and so they find out at night when he sleeps he takes up his original form. There's another story about a layman with his wife, and he sees a monk who has a beautiful skin color, and he says, I wish my wife had such a beautiful skin, and flip, he is changed into a woman. And he runs away and then gets married and gets children. So, I mean, it's a full-fledged sex change. There's another story about a monk who is able to change the palace of the king into gold, just like this. So, if one takes these things literal, I think it becomes very difficult. But my own suggestion then is rather to see that these are stories, especially the Vinaya stories, are coming out of a teaching context. And some of these stories are not really, maybe even originally not really meant as historical records, but as tales that illustrate something. And I have written about that in my Genesis of the Bodhisattva Ideal in regard to what we call the Jatakas, the stories of what tradition believes were past lives of the Buddha. And I have tried to show that many of these Jatakas arise out of an original teaching context where they were just an allegory, just a story, just as if such and such thing would happen. And then we get another text, once upon a time such and such a thing happened. And then we get another text, once upon a time such and such a thing happens, and so was the Buddha in a past life. This is how he knows about it. And so we can trace this development, and I think there's a lot on literalism, which is perfectly natural in an oral transmission and with all the of religious literature that has made things that originally probably, as far as we can tell, may have been meant allegorical, come to be literal truth. At one point I was giving maybe 2 lectures ago where I think that this whole idea of Buddha and the monks flying around from here to there may have at an earlier stage been just the idea that they were using their Manomaya Kaya. So that is a body made by the mind. So this is I don't like to call this astral body, but I don't know a better term in English to give the sense. So if that is the original sense, then the physical body of the Buddha would still have been seated wherever he was in meditation, and he was just moving around with his mind to another place. And that gives quite a different impression to these instances. And another thing is also on this very literal reading, one loses a lot of humor. Many of these tales, and this I have tried to show in several of my papers, especially tales about gods, if one reads them carefully, there comes out a lot of humor. But if one takes it all fully literal, I think it becomes very difficult. I mean, I don't want to just dismiss this type of approach, because I have many friends who are actually living in that kind of frame of mind, and I fully respect that also. But I think for us in the West, and now I'm talking as a Westerner, I think it's good to not to just dismiss it all, one extreme, and not to just take it over all the other extreme, but have this middle way of seeing that these are stories out of a certain historical context, and some of this may just be an allegory. Yeah. Then now we come to Madhyama-āgama 80. And there are questions about translation terminology. There's a general question by Jeff Hardin. Yeah, I think I pasted in. First of all, when you translate Chinese agamas, do you use the English equivalent for the translated Pali technical term, even if it is not the best literal translation of the Chinese into English? It seems that sometimes, excuse me, the Chinese parallel seems to use different wording in English than the parallel passage from the translated Pali. To what extent do these reflect true transmission errors versus the results of the imprecise art of translation? Yeah, that's a very complex topic. You see, this Madhyama-āgama translation, we are actually, originally we were 3 editors, and now we are still 2 editors. So, especially during the early stages, the decisions were taken by 3, and I was the one in our group who was strongest on trying to recognize the underlying Indic text, and also trying to adopt as much as we can. We find this correct for the Pali term, trying to adopt the translation terminology used by Bhikkhu Bodhi, because that is pretty much the standard translation now, and it's just easier for those who don't know the original. But in a few cases, the other 2 were of the opinion that we should use a different English term, even though we know it's the basic Pali is the same. And one of the other 2 in the group, he has a very strong sinological background. He was very strong on this is Chinese. But I think it is not really that much Chinese in a sense, because I think it's actually an Indic text, like what we have here in front, Madhyama-āgama 81, we are going to discuss later on. This is a text that has come into being in India, was produced by Indians, was transmitted in India for 8 centuries maybe, 7 centuries, whoever. And then at some point it was brought to China, within a few years translated into Chinese, and then this is pretty much the version we have. So I think it's like just imagine an Indian wearing traditional Chinese clothes. It's not really a Chinese product of the Chinese. I mean, immensely grateful to the Chinese for their immense translation efforts. This is not the question. But it's not in itself a text produced in China. And in my studies of the Agamas so far, it is only in the Ekotarika Agama where I have been able to show distinct signs of Chinese contribution to the text beyond mere translation. But particularly in Madhyama-āgama, to me seems to be a very, as far as I can tell, a very faithful rendering of the Indian original. Therefore, my personal take is that inasmuch as the Chinese allows, we should translate what the text, we should translate the underlying Indic original. I remember one translator meeting, there was others also, and there's this term, Shengse, that is the Chinese character for birth and the Chinese character for bodily form. So something like birth body or birth form, which, I mean, totally makes no sense whatsoever. And everybody was struggling, and I mean, I'm not telling this because this time I found it, normally the others are much better, but I found it means jata rupa, gold. Jata, birth, rupa, form. So unless, in fact with the agamas, unless you have some familiarity with the Indic languages, Pali, Prakrit, Sanskrit, it's difficult to understand them because they have these translations that make simply no sense on their own unless you start to reconstruct the underlying Indic text. So I think it is important, but also there's the other danger, of course, that one starts to read what one expects into the Chinese, and sometimes there are borders. And one of these was brought up by two such cases were brought up by Michael Bizert. So one is the translation, and we are now with Madhyama-āgama 80, right attentiveness. And right attentiveness is the same as sampajanya in Pali, and this is one of the cases where the others two in the translation team were in the majority. I would have preferred to use the translation that Bhikkhu Bodhi uses for sampajanya. So here it is our fault as translators that does not enable you as the reader to recognize this is the same as the Pali. But then another one that also mentioned by Michael Bizert was mental aspiration and undivided mindfulness. And in the Pali Suttas, Bhikkhu Bodhi translates that as establishing mindfulness before him. And here we have two different originals. That establishing mindfulness before him is this Parimokkhasati, and the Chinese clearly is not a rendering of Parimokkhasati. And on that term of translation, there's a third question by Michael Bizert. Later in the discourse, the word influxes is used. Bhikkhu Bodhi usually translates asavas as taints. Is influxes your preferred translation for asavas, or does Madhyama-āgama 80 use a different word which would make influx more adequate? Yeah, and this is one of the cases where I have consciously decided to not use Bhikkhu Bodhi's translation terminology. There are very few cases where I don't follow him. I think it's Nibbida, I prefer disenchantment to revulsion, and dukkha, I prefer unsatisfactoriness to suffering, and asava, I prefer influx. The Chinese is the same. The Chinese clearly is a rendering of influx, asava, or taint. And I wanted to explain, because the asavas are very central for the soteriological scheme in early Buddhism for awakening, and why I think asava is better translated as influx. Behind the choice of the appropriate terminology for this term stands a scholarly discussion. There are three scholars, I'm just putting in the references here, who have argued, here they are, yeah, no, it's not coming completely, it's one missing, Richard Gombrich. So it's Hermann Jacobi. He was in 1940 in his article on Jainism, then Professor K.R. Norman in his philological approach to Buddhism, and Professor Richard Gombrich in his What the Buddha Thought. The basic argument is that the term asava has been taken over from the Jain tradition. In the Jain tradition, the term asava refers to what flows in onto the soul and obscures the soul with a fine material substance because of any unwholesome activities done in the past lives and now. And thus the task of liberation is to purify the soul from this accumulated cover of what has flown in, of these defilements, this material defilement of the soul, and once that has achieved, then liberation is attained. And the scholars all point out that the Buddhism must have borrowed the term from the Jains and kind of, I paraphrase a little bit, it's almost as if they didn't really understand what it meant, because in Buddhism there's no soul and so nothing can flow in onto this soul, and the whole conception of defilement of the mind in Buddhism is different. We are not talking about material substances, but about a purely mental approach. And I assume the idea of taint comes predominantly from one discourse, and here is the reference. And this describes a boil. So a boil that discharges, and if you strike it, or if you hit it, if it gets infected, more and more asavangdeti, more and more it will give rise to some impure outflux, some impurity that comes out, this pus kind of thing. And so the argument is that this passage actually shows that in Buddhism the asava is something that flows out, and that is somehow that is a tainted substance. I'm not quite sure where the idea taint comes from, but the idea of outflow comes precisely from this discourse. And this, as far as I can see so far, is pretty much the established opinion in scholarly circles, except for one, and this is Professor Schmidhausen. Here I've given the reference, and here is the quote. So he says, asrava or asava may in Buddhist text also denote annoyances, trouble, suffering. He adds that in the case of asava, the most archaic meaning is dangers or disturbances rushing or intruding upon the ascetic. And I think this quote, for my own understanding, has really helped me to broaden my understanding of asava. And then I turned to, when I did my study of the Majjhima Nikaya, the Sabbasava-sutta, Majjhima Nikaya 2, which has several Chinese Agama parallels, the second discourse in the Majjhima Nikaya. It's on all the asavas, and it is, I believe, the most detailed examination of asavas in the early canon. If I don't remember another passage that gives so much information on this topic of the asavas. And so this Sabbasava-sutta presents 7 methods for overcoming the influxes. Let's see if I can get this pasted in here. Yeah. So seeing, dasana, restraining, sangvara, using, patisevana, enduring, adivasana, avoiding, parivajjana, removing, vinodana, and developing, bhavana. Seeing means to see the Four Noble Truths instead of any kind of speculation. Restraining means to be guarded at the sense doors. Using means to use one's requisites properly, that is, robes, bowl, food. Enduring is enduring various types of hardships that one invariably encounters in the ancient Indian setting as a wanderer. Avoiding is that one is intelligent enough to avoid what is dangerous and unsuitable, like going close to a wild animal that might bite one or something like that. Removing means to remove whatever is unwholesome in one's own mind. And developing is to develop what is wholesome, in particular the awakening factors. So if we look at these, some of these activities don't really have a relationship to flowing at all, and some of them do even seem to be about flowing in. In particular, I think the flowing in, I mean, we had Professor Schmidhausen's suggestion of these hardships and what is dangerous. These are already 2 things that can come from the outside towards one. But particularly important, I think, is guarding the sense doors. And in the guarding the sense doors, in the traditional description of sense restraint, it speaks that the purpose of such sense restraint is said to be to avoid the flowing in anvasavati of what is unwholesome. And anvasavati, from philologically speaking as a Pāli term, is closely related to asava. It's the same basic term. So it's clear that first of all, the idea that in Buddhism asava means an outflow and is a sort of maladaptation of jhana usage, I think is not supported by this discourse. And in general also, I find it difficult to posit either the Jain or the Buddhists as being the first and the others as those who have borrowed, because the textual testimony we have for both traditions cannot be so clearly set in time and in general that we can say this one is early and this one is later. Especially the Jaina tradition, because as far as we know the Jaina canon came to a closure much later than the Buddhist canon. And my personal feeling is that the most useful approach to Buddhist and Jain tradition is to see them as two members of the Shramana tradition who had a common heritage of ideas and words without trying to posit one as the originator and the other one as the one who borrowed. And the idea of asava, particularly in context of sense restraint, has clearly to do with influence. I restrain my sense doors to avoid detrimental influences on my mind. And this is very much in line with the general early Buddhist approach to redefine ideas of purification already present in the ancient historic environment, but to give them a psychological approach. And so my personal feeling based on what I have said so far is that the idea of influence, what influences us, and what in some cases might quite literally flow in on us, is, as far as I can understand, the best way of grappling with this term asava. And this is why in my translation I prefer influx, as to me it captures much better this breadth of meaning that emerges particularly from Sabbasava Sutta than the term taint. But the term taint is certainly also correct. I'm just explaining my personal preference. There's a comment by Martin Seidensticker. A stock passage in the sutras indicates that the term's real significance independently of etymology, when it describes the asavas, it states that defile, bring renewal of existence, give trouble, ripen in suffering, and lead to future birth, aging, and death. Thus other translators, bypassing the literal meaning, have rendered it cankers, corruptions, or taints. The three taints mentioned in the Nikayas are respectively synonymous for craving for sensual pleasures, craving for existence, and ignorance. Yeah. But I agree. But I mean, this works similarly with the idea of influx. Whereas I think taint and corruption does not work so well with the Sabbasava Sutta. Thank you for the comment, Martin. There's another question by Jeff Harding. What can we make of a Chinese discourse that has no Pali parallel, like Madhyama-āgama 18? In the Pali Tipitaka, if the Pali Tipitaka is considered to be a complete canon, would not absences of Pali counterparts to Chinese agamas suggest lost Pali sutras or fabricated Chinese agamas? Yeah, the fact that Madhyama-āgama 80 has no Pali parallel points to two possibilities. Either such a discourse did exist and was lost or never came to be included in the Pali discourse collection, or the second one, it is a later development. And we find this fluidity of tradition already incorporated in the account of the first Sangiti in the Pali Vinaya. here's the reference. It's a very interesting episode that the monks have finished their recitation of the canon, and then they go to another monk called Purana, and they say, look, we have recited all these things, and you should also follow this. And he says, yes, you have recited very well, thank you, but I think I will remember the things the way I heard them myself from the Buddha. And I think this episode is very, very significant, because the account of the first Sangiti, sometimes translated as council, is an important reference point in the different tradition as the time when the canon was established as authentic from their perspective. So to have this episode that this is immediately put into question is very interesting, and it just shows the fluctuability, the unfixedness of the oral transmission of these discourses at an early stage. And we have to remember this Sangiti, this first Sangiti. Again, we are back there to the topic we had earlier. I mean, it's not just an allegory or a myth, but again, there have been several scholars who have pointed out that the historicity of this Sangiti is somewhat doubtful. And my personal take on this story, the Buddha has just passed away, and so it's natural for the monks to congregate. And there is Ananda, who has been the attendant of the Buddha, and he was a Bahu Sutta, learned in the sense of somebody who really had heard a lot. And so it's natural for those monks who have been wandering around in different parts of India to, if I may use the modern term, to update the stock of discourses that they are familiar with. Yeah, you have to imagine, like, the Buddha is teaching in one part, and some monks live somewhere else, and so they come in contact with somebody who's just seen the Buddha. You saw the Buddha? Any new discourses? Let me know. Come, let me learn it. There's a continuous process of improving the stock of orally transmitted literature in different parts of the India, going on continuously. And somebody who is living very far away and has little chance of meeting monks who have seen the Buddha recently, he or she, a nun, whoever, might have had a very, not the latest update. They might be years behind or have very few suttas only. And so when all these monks now congregate at this time, it is perfectly natural for them to ask Ananda, any news? Let us have what has been said recently. And so there's a kind of an updating. But at that time, the idea of a formation of a canon seems very improbable. And it seems more like in later times, once a division has been there, different schools, different Buddhist schools, disagreement about what the Buddha actually taught, that then looking back, such a kind of perhaps somewhat informal meeting was then considered to be a real council with the proceedings, and now we are settled it, and this is authentic, and this is like this. In fact, we find that in the different Vinayas, even the sequence of the four Nikayas or Agamas differs. Some say the long collection was cited first, but then another one says, no, the Samyukta was the first collection to be recited at this first council or first Sangiti. So we see this fluctuability right from the beginning. And so for me, it is not a surprise to find a discourse in the Chinese Agamas that has no Pali parallels. And as Jeff rightly said, we don't really know. My personal take on Madhyama-āgama 80, the story of Anuruddha needing a robe and the Buddha personally intervening to make a robe is very beautiful, but I have not come across it anywhere else. This is not necessarily a sign of lateness, but there is a whole genre of discourses in the Madhyama-āgama which give a lot of emphasis to the disciples. There's a whole chapter on Ananda. We read some of the discourses together. This chapter has a lot on Anuruddha. And so I kind of wonder if this is the outcome of a tendency very soon after the Buddha passed away, and a hagiography, a history of the Buddha had already come into being, that now also the first generation of disciples has passed away, and the next generation wants some more material on these disciples also. Still remember, we are in an oral setting. There is no TV, there is no internet, there is no iPhone, there are no books. All you have is stories others tell you. And so to enrich your relationship to the tradition, you want some histories of those people. You hear this Ananda and Anuruddha and so on. So what are they about? What did they do? One wants some more information. And so it is possible that Madhyama-āgama 80 has come into being out of such type of need. And if this pure speculation on my side should be correct, then it would mean that it is not part of the very earliest transmission. But there are discourses in Madhyama-āgama, also in the other agamas, even in Ekotarika-āgama, which are give us such an impression of earliness that I would find it very difficult to put them as late. One example I discussed in a paper on it's about this idea that the Four Noble Truths are built on an analogy with ancient Indian medicine, with the diagnostic scheme in ancient Indian medicine, which diagnoses disease, cause of the disease, state of health, and cure. And so the Four Noble Truths, and taken from this scheme. And there's a discourse in Samyutta-āgama and in the other Samyutta-āgama also, and we have Tibetan and I think an Uyghur version. And there are also two clearly distinct transmission lineages. It's not just one single discourse. We do not have this discourse in Pāli, but we have references to this idea in another discourse and also in the Visuddhimagga, in the Vimutttimagga. It's all over the place. So my argument is, in this case, even though we don't have a Pāli version, I would consider this discourse as early. I see no reason why we should consider it as late. It could simply be all of this situation of transmission. And if you remember that the Buddhist schools probably came into being because of geographical separation, and their splitting is not because of philosophical ideas, but because of disagreement about the Vinaya. And disagreement about the Vinaya can simply also happen if you have different pratimoksha's, the code of rules. During recitation in some area, if there come to be changes, then somebody from another part will no longer be able to accept that set of rules because it's different from the one he had, and so a split can come into being. So this coming into being of different Buddhist schools is different from what we know from Western history, but has a lot to do with geographical separation. And within geographical separation, easily changes can come into being, or you have a transmission lineage from one group of monks that never got to hear that one particular discourse. So the situation there is such that we cannot come to a firm decision based on the mere fact that, okay, this discourse in Pāli has no Chinese parallel, or this discourse in the Chinese has no Pāli parallel. They are obviously suspect, but we cannot come on a firm conclusion as such. So comment by Dhammadinna, influence is very nice because etymologically it comes from fluere, Latin, to flow into, of a flux, much like the influxes. Yeah, that is the point that I wanted to make with that, and that I think this influence, what Martin brought up, is that it defiles, is that it brings renewal of existence, etc. So the term influence works very well with that. But that is just, I was not criticizing other translations as cankers or taints. I was just explaining why I prefer to use the term influx. Thank you, Dhammadina. There's a question by Patrick Conway. Excuse me. This lecture brought up what seems to be two countervailing narratives in the canon with regard to pursuit of the holy life. On the one hand, there are many passages that urge the pursuit of awakening through a kind of striving that is accompanied by seclusion, isolation, and withdrawal from the world, and Madhyama-āgama 80 is an exemplary instantiation. On the other hand, one finds several passages in the suttas where the Buddha seems to extol the importance of friendship, not just as an aid to, but something essential to the spiritual path, except perhaps in the case of Pacceka Buddhas, e.g. Samyutta Nikaya 45.2. Thought this was a very interesting comment. Thank you, Patrick. In Madhyama-āgama 80, we have the gradual path description without the usual introduction that comes to this path. The usual introduction to the gradual path speaks of a Tathagata. A Tathagata arises in the world and teaches the Dharma. And this is usually found, but not found in Madhyama-āgama, because Anuruddha describes his own practice of the gradual path. And the Tathagata who arises in the world and teaches the Dharma is precisely the Kalyanamitta, the good friend that is mentioned in Samyutta Nikaya 45.2. And if we look at the end of this discourse, this is page 1525 in the translation by Bhikkhu Bodhi, we find that it is stated there explicitly. I just wanted to read that for you. Ananda, it may be understood how the entire holy life is good friendship, good companionship, good comradeship. By relying upon me as a good friend, Ananda, being subject to birth or freed from birth, being subject to aging or freed from aging, being subject to death or freed from death, etc. So the point about Kalyanamitta here is, in particular, that there is somebody like the Buddha who teaches one how to practice. And without that, it's very difficult. Tradition says a Buddha himself arises rarely in the world because the feat Buddha has to accomplish is to find the path himself without having a teacher. So the Buddha as a teacher is the Kalyanamitta, the good friend. And this teaching enables the practitioner to walk the path to liberation, but this walking of the path does require intensive practice in seclusion for the great majority of practitioners, except for the gifted few. And in between the Buddha and the disciple stands the Pacceka Buddha, excuse me, which Patrick mentioned, and this is a very interesting motive in early Buddhist discourses. Their role is not entirely clear. The term, as I've discussed in one of my papers, contrary to Professor Norman, means, Pacceka means solitary, not pratyaya, that a Pacceka Buddha has become awakened because of a particular condition. I think that interpretation proposed by Professor Norman, I disagree with that. It's clear also from the use of Pacceka in other contexts. So the basic idea of a Pacceka Buddha is a single or solitary Buddha. And the idea is that this person is capable of realizing awakening on its own, without a teacher. But the realization is such that this Pacceka Buddha is not able to teach this to others. This makes the difference between a Pacceka Buddha and a Sambuddha, who is capable of teaching others. But there are some passages where we find that Pacceka Buddhas do not necessarily live totally alone. Sometimes we also find them living in groups, so this aspect of their actual lifestyle is not clearly defined, and there are some variations. This is Shaila Catherine. She says, I'm especially moved by the gradual path articulated by Venerable Anuruddha in Madhyama-āgama 80, with the final line, relying on the precepts, established in the precepts, using the precepts as my ladder, I ascended to the hall of unsurpassable wisdom, to the pavilion of true Dharma, and with little effort I observed the 1,000 worlds. As most of us will probably agree, a foundation of virtue is so very important for the development of concentration, insight, and all the various attainments that the meditative path offers. This discourse beautifully articulates the humble foundation and the gradual development of the path of release. Although supernormal powers might be dramatic and impressive, they rest on the integrity of our commitment to virtue. Yeah, beautiful. I can't say anything to that, can only agree. And there's another comment by Linda Grace. One thing that struck me in this sutta was the quality of humility, beginning with the touching story of the Buddha joining and sewing the robes all the way through Venerable Anuruddha's description of his own process of awakening via the gradual path. While he could have focused more on his meditative attainments and extraordinary psychic powers, instead he highlights Sila as the essential foundation and ongoing support throughout the entirety of the path. Yeah, I was also very struck by this idea that the Buddha would join making a robe for Anuruddha, for one of his monks. It's something I have not come across elsewhere. There's a very beautiful story in the Vinaya where the Buddha chances upon a sick monk who is lying there in his excrements, and the other monks have kind of neglected him, and so the Buddha calls Ananda, and together they wash this monk. And the Pāli versions differ how much the Buddha did the actual washing, and in some versions we get the Sakra and the gods, then they come and wash it instead of the Buddha. But I think the original point was that the Buddha himself washed off the excrement from this monk, and this is a very powerful story also. And afterwards he calls the monks together and says, look, you have to look after each other. So I think this idea that he helps to make the robes, while in general I think Madhyama-āgama 80 may be a later product, the story itself is not totally incredible, and I also find it very touching. And this is again Linda Grace. I find this image of the ladder to be very powerful. I was considering how not only is it not possible to jump to the highest rung without mounting the ones below, the ladder needs to be well built, one which isn't going to crack and fall apart while climbing it, one which can be depended upon for safety with each step taken. Excuse me. It needs to be constructed of strong material, rungs properly aligned, any cracks or splintering or shakiness attended to, in order for it to be a trustworthy support, and the means whereby it's possible to reach the highest goal. The precepts as a ladder emphasize the importance of step-by-step, moment-by-moment cultivation of wholesome conditions, the purification of body, speech and mind in every aspect of life and practice that will naturally have their positive results. Yeah, thank you, Linda, for bringing out this simile in an even more powerful way. A very powerful simile indeed. So this completes my survey of the contributions made in the forum. Thanks again for all of you. And now we are ready to get into the discourse on mindfulness of the body. There's an introductory narration in both versions which I have not put in here, according to which the monks were already discussing the topic of mindfulness of the body, and then the Buddha comes to join them and then gives an exposition. So he has just come to join and has been told what they were discussing. The Blessed One said again to the monks, excuse me, Why did I declare that by cultivating mindfulness of the body widely and in detail, one will obtain great fruits? Then the monks said to the Blessed One, the Blessed One is the source of the Dharma, the Blessed One is the master of the Dharma. The Dharma comes from the Blessed One. May he explain it. Having heard it, we will come to know its meaning fully. The Buddha said, listen closely and pay careful attention. I shall explain its meaning to you. Then the monks listened to receive instruction. This is just a standard pericope we get to show that how the Buddha is being asked to expound a particular topic. The Buddha said, how does a monk cultivate mindfulness of the body? And before continuing, I need to mention something I think I already mentioned briefly in the forum. When the discourses use the term monk bhikkhu, then this is not meant in an exclusive manner. It was a standard pattern in those times, apparently, that speaking to all who are present, one would address only part of the congregation. So if there's the king and all his followers, then one must say, just talk to the king. Or we had it in a few discourses back that there was Anuruddha and his two friends, and instead of calling all three by their name, the address is Anuruddhas, plural. And now if I look at all of you who are present, I would just say Bhikkhu Arya Dhammika or Bhante. I would just address him, but it is not meant that I'm only talking to him and not to anyone else. So here this is the same. The practice is in generally open to anyone. At the same time, however, the use of the term bhikkhu or bhikkhuni implies that in the ancient setting, the going forth as a monk or a nun was held to be the ideal environment and form for intensive practice. Okay, I continue. When walking, a monk knows he is walking. When standing, he knows he is standing. When sitting, he knows he is sitting. When lying down, he knows he is lying down. When falling asleep, he knows he is falling asleep. When waking up, he knows he is waking up. When falling asleep or waking up, he knows he is falling asleep or waking up. Yeah, the difference here with the Pāli parallel is that Majjhima Nikaya 119 does not explicitly mention falling asleep or waking up as part of this particular exercise. The practice described here, according to my understanding, is a foundational practice for tranquility and insight. My understanding is that this requires a whole body awareness with whatever one does. And this is something extremely crucial for bridging formal meditation practice and everyday life. It is a backdrop for formal sitting, to be aware of one's sitting posture and then do whatever practice of tranquility and insight one may wish to engage in. And it is something that even now, talking to you, or as you sit there, wherever you are in the world, to listen to me, as you get up after the lecture to do something, is something that can be done continuously. And being aware of the whole body, instead of being aware of a small part of it, like the breath or the touch sensation on the feet or whatever, encourages a very broad state of awareness that enables reacting to anything that happens in the outside world. It does not exclude things, but at the same time it gives a centering. And this centering role is described in two similes. This is the reference for the first one, Samyutta Nikaya 4720. volume 5, page 170. The simile of carrying a container full of oil on one's head. The simile is that this person is given a container full of oil to carry, and in ancient India things were carried on the head, so we imagine he or she puts it on the head, like maybe the glass I take here to drink water, so put it on the head and balance it somehow. Maybe holding it also, and this is full of oil to the brim. And now this person has to carry it through the marketplace, and on the marketplace there's the most beautiful girl of the town, and she is doing a performance. She's singing and dancing. You can imagine this Indian music, very sweet, and with all these, it is very religious. It's not just about sexy. They have all these hand forms to show, like, this is the god Ganesha and so and so, and then this very sweet voice and beautifully dressed. And around her this crowd of spectators. And any one of you who has been to India knows that Indians have a very different notion of physical distance. Like we Westerners like to have people at a distance, and Indians, they come very close. They can be right up in your face. And so this person has to walk through this crowd without spilling a single little bit of the oil. And if even a little bit of oil is split, just behind him there is somebody with a drawn sword, and he will cut off his head right there. So this simile gives a very strong sense of being totally centered. Don't lose your balance, and be aware of what happens around you. Because as this crowd is moving there with the girl dancing, you can't just go through. But you have to be totally centered, but at the same time be aware how to best get through this crowd. What's just happening now? Not just closing off. And this is a very important aspect. There's a recurrent stories of meditators on intensive retreat, and then coming out of intensive retreat and finding it very difficult to handle outside world. And one problem is that this effort on concentration, even in the dry insight meditation practice, the moment-to-moment concentration, has some exclusive aspect to it, that one does not one tries to focus on one particular thing, whether it's the rise and fall of the abdomen, or the breath at the nostril, or the touch sensation of the feet, or whatever. And it becomes very difficult to relate to things outside. And in this simile, it would be like the person is totally focusing on that oil and on that center, but not really aware of what's happening around. And as the crowd dances, then the whole crowd comes across him, and however centered he will be, the oil will get spilled. In that situation, we cannot afford to be totally just with ourselves. There has to be that antenna towards the outside. And the other simile, Samyutta Nikaya 35-206 in volume 4, page 200 of the Samyutta Nikaya, is the simile of the 6 animals. 6 wild animals of different types are caught and bound together, each with a string, and the string all together in the middle. So there's the parallel versions differ a little bit, but one of the animals is a monkey, and another animal is a crocodile, probably a very small little crocodile, because if it's a big crocodile it would eat the other animals, but it's a very small one, let us imagine. And there's a dog, and there's a bird, etc. And so as soon as these animals are now all bound together and let go of, they will all try to escape. And that small tiny little crocodile, it just wants to get into the water, it pulls in that direction. And the monkey wants to go to the next tree, it pulls in the other direction. And the bird wants to go up in the sky, it pulls into the upper direction. And the dog wants to return to the village, it pulls still another direction. And imagine that these animals are more or less of the same strength, so maybe a very big bird and a very small crocodile. Then depending on who is the stronger one, it goes for sometime in this direction, for sometime in that direction, forward, backward, and they keep pulling in this direction until one gets tired and the others pull another direction. And then there's another setting, the same animals bound together, but a strong wooden post put in the middle, choke. And all these 6 animals are bound to that post. Each of them pulls for some time, wanting to get off, but eventually it just sits down by the post because the pulling gives no reaction. There's no way to get away, and they give up. And this, similarly, the 6 animals stand for the senses, and the strong post is Kāyagatāsati, the topic of this discourse, and particularly exemplified in this first exercise, mindfulness of the body. So, mindfulness of the body, this whole body mindfulness, to be with one's sitting, walking, lying down, whatever it is, it gives a possibility to be centered so that the pull of the senses in this and that direction doesn't pull one off center. This is another problem that happens after intensive meditation when one goes out into the world. It's just overwhelming. Being in a retreat setting, I had that one time doing a 1-month retreat in the desert in Rajasthan, and on my way back at Delhi airport, the flight was cancelled, and so they put me into a 5-star hotel in Delhi. And the shift from everything was beige there in the desert, the food was very bland, just simple rice and dal, and 1 month doing nothing but meditating and everything beige, and then all of a sudden Delhi 5-star hotel. I was very difficult for me to handle this transition, because at that time I had not yet been so strong on cultivating mindfulness of the body. But this whole body mindfulness gives a centering force, so that this pull of the senses in this and that direction will not pull the whole person off, and after some time they will calm down. And this is the beauty and the power of this exercise. I continue with the description. Without spilling the oil. In this way, a monk, however he acts with his body, he knows it as described above as it really is. In this way, dwelling in a secluded spot, with the mind free from indolence, practicing energetically, he removes any defilements from the mind and attains concentration of the mind. Having attained concentration of the mind, he knows the body as described above as it really is. This is how a monk cultivates mindfulness of the body. So this passage comes after each of the exercises that we will be looking at today, and I don't think we'll be finishing today, so probably also next time. It always this is the main theme of this discourse, that there's a certain way of developing mindfulness with the body, and we will be seeing several alternative approaches, and it always has to do with developing knowledge as it really is. And this knowledge as it really is then leads to retiring to seclusion, what we just discussed, practicing energetically to remove defilements from the mind, and to lead to concentration, to samatha. So here we have another way how insight leads on to tranquility. And having attained concentration of the mind, he knows the body as described of as it really is. It feeds back into insight. The Pāli version has a slightly different formulation. It speaks of, instead of removing defilements, it speaks of removing memories and intentions related to the household life. So here's the next exercise. Again, a monk cultivates mindfulness of the body as follows. When going out and coming in, a monk clearly knows, contemplates and discerns this action well. When bending or stretching, lowering or raising any of his limbs, he does so with appropriate deportment. When wearing his outer robe and other robes and carrying his bowl, he does so properly. When walking, standing, sitting, lying down, falling asleep, waking up, speaking and keeping silent, all these activities he clearly knows. In this way a monk, and here would now be again the full passage we just had, seclusion, concentration, etc. This is how a monk cultivates mindfulness of the body. So the corresponding description in the Pāli version: a monk is one who acts in full awareness when going forward and returning, who acts in full awareness when looking ahead and looking away, who acts in full awareness when flexing and extending his limbs, who acts in full awareness when wearing his robes and carrying his outer robe and bowl, who acts in full awareness when eating, drinking, consuming food and tasting, who acts in full awareness when defecating and urinating, who acts in full awareness when walking, standing, sitting, falling asleep, waking up, talking and keeping silent. Yeah, we note that the Pali version speaks also of defecating and urinating, which the Chinese does not have. But alongside such smaller differences in formulation, the basic point, as far as I can understand, of this exercise is it goes a step further than the exercise before, where the point was just this being fully aware with the body as a whole. And here we have this element, the Pali sampajanya, that was the term that Michael Bizet had asked about before. Sampajanya, I like clear knowing, clear comprehension. It has a pajanya, panya, it has a slight flavor of wisdom to it. It means to do things properly, and we have that explicitly in the Chinese version. Can you see there? He does so with appropriate deportment. That I think helps really to understand that this is something that, particularly for us monastics, is considered an important aspect of proper conduct, that we behave in a way that is considered appropriate. Like, for example, being out on the road, we shouldn't be jumping around and like raising our arms and shouting or things but have a kind of a centered and quiet form of conduct. And this is not merely just to impress others, but it actually has an important function for one's own practice. Because when the more one adopts a natural, not an enforced one, but a natural calm behavior, this in turn really supports mental calmness. And one finds that behaving in a very agitated manner and jumping around and shaking around, it will be very difficult for the mind to be calm. So the two work in tandem. The calmness of the mind expresses itself in calmness of bodily activities, and calmness of bodily activities in turn increases mental calmness. Yeah, now we get an exercise that is not found in the Pali version. Again, a monk cultivates mindfulness of the body as follows. When evil and unwholesome thoughts arise, a monk controls, abandons, eradicates, and stops them by recollecting wholesome states. And we also get a simile. It is just as a carpenter or a carpenter's apprentice might apply an inked string to a piece of wood to mark a straight line, and then cut the wood with the sharp adze to make it straight. In the same way, and then in this way a monk cultivates mindfulness of the body. Yeah, I think not only the fact that this exercise is not found in the Pali version, but even if you look at it from the context, this has no direct relationship to mindfulness of the body. Much rather, this is mindfulness of the mind. It's mindfulness of thoughts. So it does not really have a proper place here. And I have a theory how it got there, but I want to take this together with the next exercise, which similarly is not found in the Pali version. Again, a monk cultivates mindfulness of the body as follows. With teeth clenched and tongue pressed against his palate, A monk uses the willpower of his own mind to control his mind, to control, abandon, eradicate, and stop evil thoughts. It is just as two strong men might grab a weak man and turning him this way and that might beat him up as they wish. In the same way, etc., and in this way a monk cultivates mindfulness of the body. Yeah, so we have comparable exercises to these two in the Vitakkasanthana-sutta of the Majjhima Nikaya and its Madhyama-āgama parallel. And these two discourses present a method for gradually dealing with unwholesome thoughts. And within this scheme we have this idea of overcoming unwholesome thoughts by replacing them with something wholesome. The Pali version's simile that explains this also speaks of a carpenter, but there the point is that the carpenter removes something gross with something more subtle. And we get, as the last of 5 methods, this description that one really beats down the mind with teeth clenched and tongue pressed against the palate. The last one here has to be understood within the context of the whole series of 5 methods given in the Vitakkasanthana-sutta as a last resort when everything else has failed. It is not a practice that on its own leads to awakening. In fact, in another discourse, I've discussed this in my Satipatthana book already. In another discourse, the Buddha reckons this exercise on its own as something that does not lead to awakening. But it comes in what I think is its original context in the Vitakkasanthana-sutta and its parallel. It comes in a context where first just being mindful of unwholesomeness has not worked. Then one uses these 5 methods, one after the other. And every time one finds still I am obsessed by this unwholesome thought. So at the final point, this comes in, I think, to prevent the unwholesome thought from leading to unwholesome speech or action. It is an emergency brake. An emergency brake has its place in any vehicle, any car, any train or whatever. But obviously, if one just keeps pulling the emergency brakes, one will not progress. But on the other side, never using it, it's also nonsense, because sometimes with an emergency brake one can avoid an accident. So that is the point of this exercise within its original context. And now my hypothesis how this got into this context is simply that the description, 10 teeth clenched and tongue pressed against the palate, and then also this image of the 2 strong men who grab a weak man, has some physical component. And so by association, I assume doing all transmission, it got carried over into this discourse here. And the other exercise before about the thoughts, unwholesome thoughts replaced by wholesome thoughts, and the carpenter simile might have been carried along with it. Because there's no logical reason why this exercise should stand in a context of contemplation of the body. And the interesting thing is, in the Madhyama-āgama collection, this discourse on mindfulness of the body is earlier than the before in the collection, than the version of the Satipatthana-sutta. And so we have these same exercises also in the Madhyama-āgama version of the Satipatthana-sutta. It seems that once this, by way of association, these 2 exercises were brought into this context of contemplation of the body, then the same template was also used for the Satipatthana-sutta. In the Majjhima Nikaya, the situation is opposite, because the Satipatthana-sutta is earlier. It's number 10. And the Kāyagatāsati-sutta is later. It's number 119. So there would have no way, not such an easy way for them to influence each other. Yeah. Just looking at the time. Let us see how far we go still. Again, a monk cultivates mindfulness of the body as follows. A monk is mindful of breathing in and knows he's mindful of breathing in. He's mindful of breathing out and knows he's mindful of breathing out. Excuse me. When breathing in long, he knows he's breathing in long. When breathing out long, he knows he's breathing out long. When breathing in short, he knows he's breathing in short. When breathing out short, he knows he's breathing out short. He trains in experiencing the whole body when breathing in. He trains in experiencing the whole body when breathing out. He trains in calming bodily activities when breathing in. He trains in calming verbal activities when breathing out. In this way, a monk cultivates mindfulness of the body. Yeah, so here the verbal activities is very clearly just a textual error. In fact, there's a footnote. You will find it if you download the file where I'm saying this. It should also be bodily activities. The description of the basic steps of mindfulness of breathing in the Majjhima Nikaya version is closely similar. A difference between the two is that the Chinese version does not have the Turner simile. We have that in the Pāli version, also in the Satipatthana-sutta. No, I think we don't have it in the 119, but only in the Satipatthana-sutta. Just as a skilled lathe operator or his apprentice, when making a long turn, understands I make a long turn, or when making a short turn, understands I make a short turn, so too, breathing in long, breathing in short. This is not found in the Madhyama-āgama at all, not even in the Satipatthana-sutta version that we have in the Madhyama-āgama. A comparison of the three versions of the Satipatthana-sutta that we have has led me to the hypothesis that mindfulness of breathing may not have been originally part of contemplation of the body. My understanding here is that the original point of mindfulness of breathing is in the context of the full description of this practice in the Ānapanasati-sutta, Majjhima Nikaya 118 and its parallels, where we are led through a progression of 16 steps altogether. And of these 16 steps, the first 4 are these that we found here, and the other tetrads, groups of 4, correspond to the other satipatthanas. My understanding is that the point of mindfulness of breathing originally was to be as a practice that on its own is a full-fledged path to awakening that covers tranquility and insight. And this is what we find described in the 16-step scheme. And we have parallels to this 16-step scheme in the Samyukta-āgama of the Mula Sarvastivada tradition, and I recently also found another parallel in the Mahasangika Vinaya. And these parallels are very closely similar. There's a small difference for the last tetrad, which is not a major difference, and there's a difference about which of these 16 steps we can consider a form of training. But otherwise they're closely similar. So with these 16 steps of mindfulness of breathing, we are very clearly on firm ground. This is early Buddhism. It's not a later invention just because it is somewhat formal, these 16 steps. Formalism is something natural to oral transmission. And it is again by the same law of association that the first 4 steps concerned with the body out of this 16-step scheme, according to my hypothesis, would have been associated with contemplation of the body. they are certainly a contemplation of the body, but the problem I see is that the full power of the 16-step scheme is lost if one practices only the first 4. The full power is really to move through all 4 satipatthanas, and the commentarial explanation according to which the second and third group of 4 is pretty much requires jhana attainment, I find that not convincing. Also, this is another question of what one considers to be actually a jhana, which I don't want to get into now. It will get much more controversy now. But it's basically based on the interpretation of the third step. He trains in experiencing the whole body. What does the whole body mean? According to the commentary understanding, the whole body refers to the whole body of the breath. So the idea is that from beginning to end, one is completely with the whole of the breath. And basically, on this understanding, then one knows the breath is long, short, and one is with the whole breath, one experiences the whole breath, and then at that point, one gets into jhana. I personally find this interpretation not so convincing, because knowing long and short, one already needs to know the breath in its whole length, so the third step doesn't introduce anything new. And I was quite happy to find that the Mahasangika Vinaya supports my understanding here, and I just paste in the translation of the relevant part, the step number 3. The Mahasangika Vinaya says, at the time of breathing in, pervading the body, one knows one is breathing in, pervading the body. At the time of breathing out, pervading the body, one knows one is breathing out, pervading the body. So there's no doubt here that the idea is to be aware of the whole body. So in the 16-step scheme, this means that from long breath to short breath, from being aware of the breath as short and long, or long and short, one then broadens awareness to become aware of the whole body as it sits here. And from awareness of that whole body, one relaxes. One calms any bodily activity. This is the breath, but this is also any bodily tension, any whatever there may be, one lets it calm down. And out of that calming down then comes the joy and happiness, is something quite natural that one experiences. And one consciously cultivates joy and happiness. And as these naturally become weaker after some time, one becomes aware of any other kind of activity in the mind, citta sankhara, and one lets these calm down. And as these calm down, one becomes aware of the mind itself, that which is aware of the breath. That which is aware, or if concentration is deepening, the nimitta, the light nimitta. And again, one gladdens the mind, concentrates it and frees it, liberates it from any kind of obstruction. And at that point, a rather deep state of concentration is reached, and on emerging naturally sooner or later that concentration will become weaker, then one contemplates impermanence, dispassion, cessation, letting go. Or according to the Chinese parallel, impermanence, abandoning, dispassion, cessation. Not such a major difference. The 3 topics that are similar: impermanence, dispassion, and cessation. So in this way, mindfulness of breathing in 16 steps covers all 4 satipatthanas. With each of them builds up a basis for the development of the 7 awakening factors, and thus is capable of leading to knowledge and liberation. Yeah, this is a nice moment to stop. Knowledge and liberation. Leave you to do the practice. And we continue after mindfulness of breathing next time. Yeah. Thank you very much for your attention. I hope there was some things of interest. I look forward to your comments and discussions in the forum. And yeah, until next week, keep that bodily mindfulness with you if possible.